100 years seems like an awful long time. But actually in the life of the church, it's the blink of an eye. And so when I was thinking about what to say for the centennial of World War I looked back to see what had come before. What we find is that World War I, which has a number of nicknames, such as the Great War, or the War to End All Wars, you may chuckle at that. World War I truly is a pivotal moment. So it poses the question, what are we pivoting from, and what are we pivoting to? So I will leave the what are we pivoting to somebody else to give another lecture. But I want to talk about what we've left behind. So what happened in World War I to cause a transition? Well, we've got to go back 1,114 years earlier. Christmas Day of the year 800. A man knelt on a porphyry stone. It still is there in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And Charlemagne was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. From that day, Christmas of the year 800, until World War I, Europe embarked upon a very ambitious cultural project which we loosely define as Christendom. There are many different political manifestations that came and went during that time. There was very rarely one unified political entity for expanding over all of Europe, or at least the majority of Europe. However, there were certain ideals that were shared by various political entities over that 1100-year span. So if you were to go to St. Peter's Basilica today, as you climb the steps and go into the porch of the Basilica, you would find a statue to your right of the Emperor Constantine. It's Constantine that legalized Christianity. However, Constantine never really, despite the fact that he was eventually baptized, he never really saw himself as trying to establish a political entity that was Christian. He was the emperor, and he was going to rule as emperors had always ruled, but with a benevolence towards Christianity instead of towards paganism. To the left side of the porch, though, you find another equestrian statue, this one of Charlemagne. Charlemagne, arguably, is the first who attempted on a large scale to take Christian ideals and apply them to government. So it is that we find Charlemagne there on the porch of St. Peter's. Now mind you, both these emperors are on the porch. They're not inside the basilica. We don't honor either of them as saints, although some of the Eastern Orthodox churches honor Constantine in that way. But what we want to concentrate on this evening as we think about what World War I did is how this project that was never a strategic plan like we do in corporate America, but rather a set of ideals that were shared and that were followed with varying amounts of success over those centuries, how those ideals were gradually abandoned and then finally rejected. So if we were to summarize what those ideals were, at their best, there's a one-word kind of definition, one word that kind of captures the flavor of this. We call it chivalry. Chivalry. A certain nobility of purpose to the human endeavor. largely it's about the role of men. Who is a Christian gentleman to be? Well, I'm speaking to the Knights of Columbus, so I hope that all of you have some sense of chivalry and have some sense that Christendom was about men stepping forward to take on a responsibility as a Christian in guiding the affairs of the world in a way that would be pleasing to God. Now, the affairs of the world are not always peace and kindness, are they? And so there are times that despite ideals to follow the Prince of Peace, there were many, many times that wars intruded. So we're not at all saying that there was some utopia that existed before World War I that all of a sudden magically disappeared. What I'm trying to convey is a sense that there were ideals that we continually fell short of. But no matter how often we failed to live up to those ideals, no matter how terribly far we departed from them at certain moments, culturally, collectively, those remained our shared ideals. With World War I, it's not so much that political entities vanished, although they did, and we'll talk about that. It's that a common vision of life with shared ideals was not just something that failed, it was something that was shattered and then rejected. So, chivalry relies on a certain nobility of purpose, as we said, a certain seeing of ourselves with a dignity, and seeing all human life with a dignity. Those knights in shining armor, what did they do? They rescued damsels in distress. Now, obviously not all knights and not all damsels, but what we get at is the fact that there were rules. There were societal rules, expectations that were placed upon even such terrible things as warfare. So all of you have probably heard about the Geneva Conventions, right? And how the Red Cross and other organizations try to tame warfare and to ensure basic human rights. We pat ourselves on the back saying that this is some newfangled modern invention, and aren't we so wonderful that we've progressed this far? But in fact, all of that is the merest shadow of the restraints that used to be imposed upon society. Chivalry had with it a sense of time. Why did the church have so many feast days? Well, partially because you couldn't be a good Catholic and fight on a feast day. You know, the Pope or the local bishop would say, no, this is a feast day. You can't go to war on this day. It was our little way of trying to tame what was a very harsh world. And the damsels in distress, why did we rescue them? Because we didn't need all sorts of legalese telling us about hostages and non-combatants. There was common sense that said, if the person there wasn't also holding a sword and coming at you, you should probably not use violence against them. So the way that these restraints became diminished as ideals, because again, this was never lived out perfectly, but the way the ideals of these restraints and this basic respect for one another became watered down and then eventually cast aside, opened the door for something as terrible as nuclear war. I mean, that may sound like a bold claim, but let me tell you that there is no way that you could conceivably drop an atomic bomb to kill an entire civilian population if you had not first abandoned entirely the gospel principles of the sanctity of human life. That's why we are told that on the day of the dropping of the atomic bomb, Pope Pius XII in Italy had a terrible vision of this violence and knew that something terrible had happened that had changed the world forever. All of that was opened up by World War I. No longer are there any limits. Do whatever it takes to win. Now, what are some of the things that led to that mentality? The rise of something we call nationalism. Nationalism. So nationalism, the rise of the nation states, ending the medieval period. You find in the modern period, the nation state largely driven by commercial and economic interests. No longer were the regional shared cultural instincts what kept you together, but rather these greater economic interests that then were defended by military power. Nationalism stands in stark contrast with something we call the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity says what can be done should be done on the lowest possible level. Now that's the fight that we find in modern America, that we don't want Uncle Sam in Washington micromanaging the things that we can do in our own local community. Subsidiarity is the big fancy theological word that says we're right and Uncle Sam's wrong, right? That what you can do at a lower level, you should do at that level, because that's where the best decisions are made. Subsidiarity, though, is not the only Catholic principle at work there against nationalism. There's a second one. Sort of like on one side we'd have an opposite that's gone too far this direction, on the other too far that one. Nationalism is against subsidiarity by making this nation state, but it's also against a certain universalism. Universalism not as a political concept as much as a social concept, which is that we should respect the rights of all humanity, no matter if they speak a different language and live on a different side of a line drawn on a map. So the Holy Mother Church proposes as far as both this local notion of community, but then also proposes for us this universal notion of community. Nationalism paired up with a nasty philosopher by the name of Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the one that argued so very strongly, powerfully in Germany of the 19th century that the will to power is what matters. That is, if you can do it, then you should do it. And if you can do it, it doesn't matter who you step on to do it. So that's obviously a very primitive summation of his philosophy, but that gives you the idea. So instead of ideals which we fail to live up to, all of a sudden the only ideal that mattered is winning. Winning at whatever the cost may be. Now there are still exceptions to this. World War I began in a series of events. June the 28th of 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was the direct descendant of that Holy Roman Empire. Therefore, Franz Ferdinand was standing in direct descent, although not by bloodline, but by rule, from Charlemagne. On June the 28th, he was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was pan-nationalist. That is, it encompassed various groups of ethnic and political entities under a large umbrella. And with his assassination, Austria declared war 1 month later on the 28th of July on Serbia for this aggression. This then set off a very complicated chain of events which was meant to protect Europe from a great war. You see, there were all sorts of treaties that the different European powers had entered into so that there was a balance of power. Surely no one would go to war because it would drag everyone into war. And who would want to do that? So they thought that these alliances would keep everybody safe. And instead, it just meant that the devastation of war would become total. And so after Austria declared war on Serbia, on the 1st of August, Germany declared war on Russia, because Russia was backing Serbia. Russia at the time was adopting a pose as the protector of all the Slavic peoples. It's a frighteningly familiar refrain. If one listens to Vladimir Putin speaking about why it's okay to invade and annex parts of Ukraine, it's because Russia is the guardian of those people. And so it doesn't matter who he has to step on or kill, Russia's going to do this. Russia was doing the same thing 100 years ago with the Serbians. The Serbians are part of our Slavic family, and so we have to defend them against the Austrians. The Germans, more closely related to the Austrians, came in with the Austrians because of their alliance. Speaking about closely related, I bet most of you didn't know that King George V of England, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas of Russia were all cousins. All cousins. This is a large family feud. But there's something about that. There's something about the fact that they were all related that staved off these huge wars in the past. That what did you do if you're a bachelor prince? You went to one of the other royal houses of Europe and you found a single princess, and the two of you got hitched, and by the two of you getting hitched, you solidified, at least to a certain extent, the peacefulness of Europe, or at least certain alliances in Europe. Not necessarily the best reason to get married, but it was the way things played out over the centuries. So all these cousins, they vacationed together. They went to see Grandma, Queen Victoria in England. All of these things, they knew one another. They were related to one another. And yet, they were dragged into war. Those years leading up to World War I saw two different strands in Europe. One was a pacifism, that we're all brothers, and therefore this nationalism stuff, we're going to get past it. Unfortunately, that brand of thinking was largely advanced by the socialists. And of course, the socialists were opposed by those governments for very good reasons. The other kind of trend in those years leading up to World War I was an arms race. An arms race. And we fed into that arms race because the United States was just growing in power. We were just beginning to flex our muscles. It was only a couple of years earlier that we waged the Spanish-American War. The first time that really we ventured very far from our own coasts. We ended up in all sorts of foreign, exotic lands, and we got a taste of empire. And then we decided that we should build ourselves up militarily, and we should play with the big boys on the world stage. World War I is the first time that America becomes involved in such a large-scale fight so far away from home. So what is it then that amidst this family feud, this arms race and this pacifism that were in conflict with one another leading up to it, we find that when Germany declares war on France and invades Belgium, that Germany has decided following Nietzsche, that war was going to happen. And if it's going to happen, we better win. And so we've got to go and hit the hardest, the fastest, and then we'll knock the other guy out before they have a chance to give us real opposition. It failed as a plan. And what we were left with was the first trench warfare that, other than a brief stints of this during the Civil War here, the American Civil War militarily pioneered some of the technological and military strategic advances that we would see in World War I. But with trench warfare, what it meant was there was a solid line from the North Sea to the Swiss Alps of fortified positions shooting at one another for 4 years. For 4 years. And there was remarkably little movement along that line. The line was sometimes only 30 yards from trench to trench. Easy for the Allies and the Axis to speak across the trenches to one another in the morning. They'd say good morning to one another. They would recognize each other's humanity. They'd tease each other like brothers, flexing their muscles on the playground. And on Christmas Day of the year 1914, there was a spontaneous truce. And they went into no man's land to bury the recently shot dead, to exchange little presents of tobacco or candy, and even played soccer against one another. And then they went back to shooting at one another later. Something like the Christmas truce gives us that sense of that medieval truce, that a feast day comes along and we lay aside our weapons and once again recognize each other's humanity. But the inhumanity of what was going on a large scale trumped these little things that reminded us. How large the scale? 70 million soldiers were engaged in World War I, of whom 10 million died and 20 million were wounded. The dream of Christian civilization was lost. After the horror of the war, there was a sense that this was something terrible and we don't want to repeat it. Why the nickname, the war to end all wars, was given. But what was put in place to try and head off any future wars was something called the League of Nations. The League of Nations was a weak and mealy-mouthed organization, the predecessor of the United Nations, which has not a considerably successful track record either. But the League of Nations was a change because it didn't look to God as the guarantor of peace. That we should not have war because we're all children of God. We should learn to play nice with one another. But rather, the League of Nations was the embodiment of the Enlightenment ideals. That it's because we're so smart that we shouldn't shoot each other, not because we're made in the image and likeness of God. So our common humanity lost its rootedness in our identity as children of God. This eventually played out when the European Union was writing its constitution, and Pope St. John Paul II argued vigorously that in the preamble of the Constitution, not even the body of the document, but in the preamble, there should at least be some mention of the Judeo-Christian roots of European civilization. And the elected ministers of the European Parliament rejected even to mention the Judeo-Christian roots of European civilization. That's where we've landed. That started with World War I. So, the nation state in some ways, replaces God. Cardinal George of Chicago just wrote this past week about some of the struggles that we're facing. And he said, there was always a quasi-religious element in the public creed of the country. It lived off the myth of human progress, which had little place for dependence on divine providence. It tended to exploit the religiosity of the ordinary people by using religious language to co-opt them into the purposes of the ruling class. Forms of anti-Catholicism were part of its social DNA. It had encouraged citizens to think of themselves as the creators of world history and the managers of nature, so that no source of truth outside of themselves was needed to be consulted to check their collective purposes and desires. But it had never explicitly taken itself the mantle of a religion and officially told its citizens what they must personally think or what values they must personalize in order to deserve to be part of the country until recent years. Cardinal George is speaking about the situation today in America. But what he's speaking about began much earlier, and that's part of the legacy of World War I. You see it even before World War I as the rise of the nation-states. You see it as people like the French revolutionaries were to go into Notre Dame Cathedral and deface all of the statues and declare that it is no longer a church, it is the temple of reason. And because they were such enlightened, reasonable men, they then went out and made the streets run blood red with their guillotine. This is enlightened reasonability. This is what happens when the gospel is not somehow at the heart of a civilization. Baptism is no longer the glue of society. It begins with the Renaissance, with secular humanism. It goes through the Reformation and the Enlightenment. And eventually it came to be in World War I that the rhetoric that was used, both by politicians and cultural leaders here in America, as well as all across Europe, spoke of the war almost like a crusade. They called it a holy war. But no longer were they fighting for God. They were fighting as good patriots for their nation. But the nation, the government, had displaced God. Walk around the monuments of Washington, D.C., they're beautiful. But they also are based upon pagan temples. There is a sense of what we call a civic religion. That is, that somehow God is fading from our consciousness as the center of society, and we're replacing God with ourselves. Our heroes are no longer the saints, but great historic figures, statesmen and politicians. And when our society becomes so cynical about politics, and when there are less statesmen, then our heroes become sports figures and leaders of business and entertainers. But God and the saints disappear. So all of this comes as part of a trend. World War I didn't pop out of nowhere. For centuries, the ideals of Christian civilization had been waning. They were still strong enough at certain moments. But in World War I, in the trenches, you see the use of poison gas. Poison gas. You find machine guns. Even the beginning of tanks. And what the commanding officers were so afraid of in those trenches, with only 30 yards separating the enemy troops, was they might realize each other's humanity. And that's why when Pope Benedict XV had asked for that Christmas truce of 1914, the governments repudiated it. The soldiers did it spontaneously on their own and were reprimanded. And even though the war was to go on 4 years longer, subsequent Christmases saw very little of that same spirit because the bloodshed was too great and we had demonized each other. Napoleon himself had started this notion of total war. He had mobilized the entire population of France. And for 12 years, he'd fought all the way to the gates of Moscow and caused, at that time, when Europe was a much smaller population, up to 6.5 million casualties. So this whole notion of our humanity that we share and that it's grounded in God and not just in a political convention that we may or may not agree on all the time. By unraveling that idea, we open our way up for what were the two greatest evils of the 20th century: Nazism and communism. In both of those ideologies, there is an atheism that is embraced, and there is the state and certain heroic quotation marks, figures that were placed as their heroes. And so that's why Adolf Hitler would have great parades and have all these uniforms, monumental buildings, and adopt all of the pomp and the pageantry that proclaimed that the state was the highest good and that's why it must be served. And the same in Russia, where even to the end of the 1980s, every year on May Day, we would watch the parade of tanks through Red Square in Moscow, proclaiming once again that the state is all-powerful. The human person is just a cog in the machinery, and that God does not exist. Now, what about other things? Those two great evils we have fought. Nazism we've defeated. But both of them came about because the end of World War I was no better than its beginning. The end starts auspiciously. After 4 years of beating their heads against the wall in the trenches, the Germans, on October the 4th, feast of St. Francis of Assisi, asked for an armistice. Then, on October the 30th, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, what we know of today as Turkey, made peace. Austria surrendered on November 3rd, but it was that the Kaiser of Germany, Wilhelm II, abdicated on the 9th. But the French army would not accept the surrender until November the 11th. Do you know why? If all these things are falling into place for a whole month preceding that, why wait until November 11th? The Kaisers abdicated, they already dispatched the week before the peace delegation. November the 11th, on the church's liturgical calendar, is the feast of St. Martin of Tours. St. Martin, who was a Roman soldier, who gave up being a soldier in the world to be a soldier for Christ. St. Martin of Tours is the patron saint of the French army. And that's why they wanted to accept the surrender on November the 11th. And in just a taste of how senseless the bloodletting was, the surrender was accepted at 5 in the morning on a railway car in a forest in France. But it was to be made effective at 11 a.m. And all through those intervening hours, Even though the telegrams were dispatched that there was to be an armistice at 11 a.m., they continued to shoot and to bombard one another, all the way to the bitter end. And the end, though a nod in the direction of a great saint, the end brought with it things that were not particularly saintly. We can speak about the end of empires. The Russian Empire fell to communism. The Austro-Hungarian Empire fell, ending that entity which had started with Charlemagne. Anyone here ever seen The Sound of Music? Yes? Okay, I'm just checking to see if you're awake. I'm not going to sing.
Thank you.
You've heard me sing, yeah. Maria, who did Maria marry? Not Christopher Plummer. Who did he play? He played Baron von Trapp or Captain von Trapp. Captain of?
The Austrian.
Austrian Navy. You ever seen a map of Austria? There is no coastline. Well, there was. There was. The reason that he was retired and sitting in Salzburg is that after World War I, Austria was made a landlocked country. The Ottoman Empire that we had fought for centuries, it ended. The famous Gallipoli campaign, if you remember that, I think there was who was it? It was a Mel Gibson movie about that back in the 80s, Gallipoli, whatever. It was Winston Churchill's worst idea. He was First Lord of the Admiralty and decided to invade in the Dardanelles, that is the straits that lead from the Mediterranean or the Aegean Sea into the Black Sea. And while he thought first it was a naval bombardment, then it was a landing, it was a very bloody affair. And eventually the Allies had to withdraw, forcing Churchill to resign at that disaster. He subsequently recovered and made some really good decisions in the next round. But with the fall of the Ottomans came the rise of a man named Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who established the modern country of Turkey. We found also during this time, though, in that area, Lawrence of Arabia. But with that whole thing, a plan to destabilize the Middle East. The last thing that the Europeans wanted with the fall of the Ottoman Empire was to see a strong, unified entity in the Middle East. And so they arbitrarily drew lines. Some of the lines were so funny that in the middle of the desert there's a straight line that then had a little bump. And they said that was where someone jarred Churchill's elbow when he was drawing the line. And these artificial lines give us present conflict in the Middle East. Those lines define Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine, Iraq. These countries were created in the aftermath of World War I. And they were created along arbitrary lines, not respecting ethnic or cultural sensibilities. And that's why, ever since, we've had constant conflict in the Middle East. So, in Europe, new states were created. And despite the fact that Pope Benedict XV had made an impassioned plea for peace and had proposed a peace plan, it was rejected. And the Versailles Treaty, with Woodrow Wilson's points, some of which did pick up good points from Pope Benedict, but in a large part, it set up a punitive system which guaranteed that within a generation there would be another war. The Treaty of Versailles was concluded on June the 28th, 1919, 5 years to the day after the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, with Franz Ferdinand's death, I need to mention one other figure that came to the fore. He was lurking in the background. This man whose name was Charles, or Karl in Germany. With his uncle Franz Ferdinand dead, Karl became the heir to the throne. And his grandfather, Franz Josef, who ruled the Austro-Hungarian Empire for 68 years, died right after beginning the war. Karl inherited it, worked very hard to try and negotiate a peace. And what the great French writer Anatole France said of him, Emperor Karl is the only decent man to come out of the war in a leadership position. Yet he was a saint, and no one listened to him. He sincerely wanted peace, and therefore was despised by the whole world. It was a wonderful chance that was lost. The Emperor Karl was forced out of his nation, died in exile a couple years later, but had been such a heroic figure, this young man who would show up in the trenches to try and encourage his troops, who risked his prestige and even his political power to send private notes to the Allies, asking them to negotiate a peace despite what his warmongering neighbor, the Kaiser, wanted. The Emperor Karl was so beloved of so many people that when the empire was carved up, and for the first time in centuries, Poland re-emerged on the European map, there was a Polish army officer, now unemployed because the empire was gone, who named his son, born in 1920, after his former commander-in-chief. So that boy's full name was Karl Josef Wojtyła. And Karl Josef Wojtyła, as Pope John Paul II, beatified the Emperor Karl, after whom he was named. That's a rare one. But he beatified him because out of all of this wreckage, Blessed Karl showed forth the ideals of Christendom. And even though all of the maps have changed, even though so many millions of lives were lost, Pope John Paul II, in the beginning of the 3rd millennium, beatified the last successor of Charlemagne and says there's something about these ideals that need to be carried forward. And maybe the European Parliament won't even make a nod to it in their constitution. But Pope John Paul II called upon us, the Christians of the 3rd millennium, to carry those ideals forward in our hearts, to not let any government or nation or ideology usurp the place of God, to respect one another's humanity, not based on any treaty, but rather on being created in the image and likeness of God. And so it is that Blessed Karl, as all of his predecessors, had been anointed as part of his coronation. Anointed of the kings, giving them a sacred duty. And Pope John Paul II was reminding us that we should demand nothing less of our leaders, that they see their roles of responsibility in government not to achieve power for themselves, or not even to achieve power for our nations, but rather as a sacred duty, a stewardship entrusted to them by God. And that no matter whether they are democratically elected or anointed as a king, all civil rulers in the end will answer to Christ the King. So with the end of World War I, we can sadly say that Christendom ended as a project that was agreed upon in its ideals by various nations and leaders. But what gives us hope is that the church sees empires and nation states come and go. And as long as we, as faithful Catholics, heed the call of the church, we can keep those ideals alive. And with the grace of God, and at some point, when humanity sees all of the devastation that has been wrought by abandoning these ideals, maybe it will be that through that faithful remnant, such as Knights of Columbus, keeping the ideal of chivalry alive, that once again we will seek to base our civilization upon the gospel, and so doing, make ourselves pleasing to God and extend the reign of Christ in the hearts of men, even here below. I'll conclude with a little bit of poetry. The most famous of all poems of World War I, In Flanders Fields, by John McCrae. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep though poppies grow in Flanders fields. That represents the spirit early on in the war, that there is a nobility of cause that was being fought for, and we should keep it going forward. Later in the war, someone like the poet Wilfred Owen could write something very different. His poem Dulce et Decorum Est, a reference to an ancient Roman epigram by Horace, meaning sweet and fitting it is to die for one's country. So the poem goes, bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod, all went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. Even some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. So Wilfred Owen very soberly rejects that heroic patriotism with which the war started, having seen too much bloodshed. And he encourages us that we might seek the peace which Christ wishes to give the world. That evil must be opposed, and sometimes that will mean war. but to never, ever remember, never ever forget how horrible war is. And that the war to end all wars did not end war. It ended something very different. It ended Christendom. But Christ is still King. And we can learn from these lessons. And we can proclaim him ever new and work in our own day, in our own way. For Cardinal George reminds us, these battles, not fought with guns, but they're around us at this very moment, right here at home. To not let the government usurp the place of God, but to keep our Christian ideals, though we as sinners, each one of us, we may not live them well at any particular moment, but to keep the ideals strong and labor as best we can with hope in our hearts that God's grace will see us through this dark age, and once again the light of Christ will triumph. Thank you.